welcome back to All Rise and Abdu. We normally start off these episodes with a little monkeying around. But today, I do apologize already at the head. I usually do some sort of terrible way to... I only know terrible ways to intro episodes. Today, we will be doing a little monkeying around, but in a different way. Because today, we are talking about one of the most famous trials in American history. We're coming up, actually the day we're releasing this, I hope, is the 100th anniversary of the last day of the trial, the closing of the trial of the so-called Scopes Monkey trial. And there's a whole history behind why it has that name, why it's been given that moniker.
Also, the scope of our monkeying will be legal.
Yes, exactly.
Wow. It was an effort to, oh my goodness. It was
sometimes it is a trial to have to work with you. But
we'll let the audience give the verdict on that one.
Yeah, okay. Oh boy. So you know the story. A lot of people might know the story in part because they've been given a certain version of it. It typically goes like this. We have this backwaters creationist Christian conservative William Jennings Bryan who hates science so much that he tries to get this poor science teacher named John Scopes fired for daring to teach the truth of evolution. And thankfully, we had this very neutral, rational lawyer named Clarence Darrow who came to defend Scopes, and then this heroic, unbiased journalist, H.L. Mencken, he's got some great lines we'll get to later, was there to sort of tell us the unvarnished truth. So that's kind of the story that has been passed down to us. Surprising, it's kind of interesting. We often talk about America as this Christian culture, but we have a lot of these sort of non-Christian revisions of history that have been passed down that we've just accepted. And so today we're going to get into some of the actual details and the truth behind what actually happened.
And this actually resulted in a movie that may have been a book before. I'm not sure. I remember seeing the movie called Inherit the Wind. And it was the dramatization of the efforts of this poor picked on science teacher to champion essentially First Amendment liberties and anti-establishment clause stuff, and whether or not science is really worth the fight because of the religious sort of powers that be are coming against it. So it's a movie called Inherit the Wind, and that has formed most of the cultural information about what people think of the so-called Scopes Monkey trial. So we have a guest with that. So one I gotta say before we bring on Rick is I'm excited in one sense about this because one for a couple reasons. The first reason I'm excited talking about this is because All Rise started as a podcast that would discuss Christian things from a legal perspective, and while that always informs our conversations in terms of my background as a lawyer and understanding evidence and argument, we haven't specifically done something on law in a while where we're talking about a trial. So I'm super excited about this. That's for one reason. But two is we're going to be channeling our inner Malcolm Gladwell here, where we're going to talk about revisionist history, about things that are often overlooked and these kind of things. And some people have this overlooking or a misunderstanding of what happened with the Scopes Monkey trial, and specifically with William Jennings Bryan specifically. So we have a special guest with us to talk about it. So I'm excited about bringing Rick on.
Yeah, so we've got Dr. Rick Townsend, who has done his PhD dissertation at the University of Texas in Dallas on this specific topic. PhD in the history of ideas, which I love that field, and I love that you got to do a PhD in it. I'm very jealous. Well, you earned the right. You earned the right to get it, and then, but also retired from the U.S. Air Force as a fighter pilot and instructor, and a career as a major commercial airline captain as well. And degrees from the Air Force Academy and a master's degree from Troy State in international relations. So a very interesting background, very interesting gentleman. Dr. Townsend, thank you for joining us today.
Well, it's a privilege to be here. I have what you might call an eclectic background. I'm still trying to figure out what to do when I grow up.
Yeah.
So, but I've gotten to do different things that, well, yeah. So I've gotten to do some things that are more aligned with my passions instead of my profession, which I enjoyed and worked hard at. But I'm really more passionate about the ideas that drive our society.
Yeah.
Good.
So the idea of history of ideas is where concepts meet culture and how they influence each other. So a big idea like Darwin's theory and how it influenced culture and how culture shaped that idea as well.
Well, and speaking of culture and the shaping of culture, we're talking about the Scopes Monkey trial at the 100th anniversary of the closing of the trial. We were talking before the show started about how some of the events that happened right after it, like the fact that William Jennings Bryan died shortly after the trial was done, which was just interesting all by itself for a number of reasons.
5 days.
Yeah, not for like any
5 days, that's right.
not for conspiratorial reasons. It's just interesting all by itself. But it does have some echoes into current culture. Specifically, the issue is with the case that by the time this airs, it'll still be a thing. It's Mahmoud versus Taylor, which is a modern echo of the issues of the same struggle, essentially, as who controls what our children are taught.
Yeah.
And Mahmoud versus Taylor, some people might know, some people might not know, is a case where you have a coalition of people from different faith traditions, Muslim, Christian, and Jew, who brought a petition essentially to get a to be able to opt their kids out of an LGBTQ curriculum being taught in their school district. And right now, the tide seems to be turning in their way because the district court has actually issued a stay on this so that they can actually do it. And it's probably going to go very far up the chain, as it were. So it's got a lot of cultural implications now. And so that sort of frames sort of a bookend, maybe in one sense, of what was really going on in the Scopes Monkey trial, as it's been called. So can I do something first and call an audible and just say, let's talk about the title that we all think of this trial on. The so-called Scopes Monkey trial, from Inherit the Wind, et cetera, et cetera. One, why is it called that, Rick? And two, why does it matter what we call it?
It's all about framing. So the official title of the trial was The State of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes. That doesn't have much of a ring to it. And our culture and the culture in 1925 was very good at putting labels on things that they wanted to frame in a particular way. And so by calling it the Scopes Monkey trial, or just the Monkey trial, or the Great Monkey trial, there's all kind of monikers that are attached to the trial itself. But by calling it something like that, it becomes more of an image maker in the public mind. And so people can say, oh, well, that's about monkeys, and their monkeys are funny. This must be something that's ridiculous. And so they made it a way that they could really pan this whole thing, partly with just renaming it in a folksy kind of a humorous way.
But let's go back, though, because one thing I want to make sure, because I want to make sure anybody is assuming they even know the trial we're talking about. I mean, it is a big deal. It's a huge point in American legal history, let alone American cultural history. But why monkey? As opposed to, obviously it can be funny, but it's got to do with evolution, essentially. So frame the case for us.
Well, yeah. So the whole issue was about whether it was legal to teach evolution of humans specifically in the public schools. And so you have Darwinism. You think about the times that we're talking. 1859, Darwin publishes Origin of Species. We're now 65 years later in 1925, and the end of the 19th century was not a time when Darwin was widely embraced immediately. It took a while for that to happen. We sometimes think of it as an immediate thing, but it was still very much in play. Mm-hmm. By 1925, the science establishment has come around largely to the Darwinian position, although Darwin himself did not provide much evidence. It was a very well-told story. He was a very good writer. He was a good marketer, but he did a lot of strawman arguments that didn't hold water. Bryan comes on the scene, and so we have to introduce William Jennings Bryan to a modern audience as well. I've been asking people what they're aware of regarding the Scopes trial, and they've never heard of it, and they haven't heard of William Jennings Bryan. But this is the man who ran for president 3 times. He ran in 1896, 1900, and 1908. He lost all 3 elections, but he was a prominent leader of the Democratic Party, but as we would understand today, much more conservative Democratic Party than it is today. He was an outspoken Christian, and after his third presidential run in 1908, he by 1911 had switched pretty much to religious advocacy, and he was still promoting social causes, but he was very much involved in evangelistic efforts. All of his talks were very much salted with the gospel and his perspective on Christianity. And so he's very, very prominent all the way through the 1924 presidential campaign was the last one at which he spoke at the National Convention of the Democratic Party. And at that point, the trial is going to portray him as this kind of older, almost dementia-ridden individual. He was anything but that. He was incredibly sharp. Even at that convention, he was cracking jokes. And he said, "This is the last Democratic convention, or the last convention at which I'm going to speak." And there was applause, because at this point he had become a bit of kind of the old guard and not as popular as he had been. And so the crowd begins to applaud when he says he's not going to speak at any more conventions. He says, "Be careful, I might change my mind." And that's the kind of thing that he would do. He would use the crowd and play off of them and make puns and jokes and get them on his side with a wry sense of humor. So that's Bryan. He was the Secretary of State leading up to World War I. Again, very prominent. It's hard for us to imagine somebody that prominent on the national stage today, who was, even if you disagreed with him, they respected him as an individual. Then on the other side, you have Clarence Darrow. And Clarence Darrow is the most famous trial lawyer of the day. He would take on cases where a union boss was accused of blowing up something, in the McCormick case, for example, and he would defend them on some basis of free speech, or things got out of control, but he's really a great guy. The trial a year before Scopes was that of Leopold and Loeb, and that trial plays a big part in Bryan's thinking as he approaches the Scopes trial. Because in Leopold and Loeb, these were two teenagers who were engaged in a thrill killing of a younger student. And their goal in killing this younger student was to prove that they were smarter than anybody, that they could get away with the perfect crime. They made lots of mistakes and were caught pretty quickly. Everybody knew they were guilty. And so Darrow was their defense attorney. And he made a defense based on the arguments that they had been taught Nietzschean philosophy and Darwinian philosophy, and basically did not think they had any responsibility for their actions. They were just products of their predetermined nature and so on. So this notorious defense got them out of the death penalty, the two teenagers, but it also made Darrow even more famous than he had been before. So you've got this incredibly natural, materialistic lawyer, very, very famous on the national stage. We don't have any lawyers that are that prominent today, other than you, Abdu, of course.
I say, but the modern equivalent would be something like a Robert Shapiro or a Johnny Cochran,
or Dershowitz, yes, Alan Dershowitz, those kind of people. But even they, I don't think, are as prominent as Darrow was at the time. So you've got this presidential stature man who's still prominent on the national scene. And you've got this trial lawyer, and you've got an ideological conflict between these guys that's hard for us to get our heads around. So that's kind of setting the stage.
You've got a Clash of the Titans almost kind of a thing happening here. Before you, I just want to make sure a clarification question so that the audience fully gets it, is that the trial was John Scopes, this teacher, is going to teach human evolution in violation of the Butler Act, in a violation of a...
Yeah, I should go into that.
Yeah. And before we get into the details of it, is that so Clarence Darrow is defending essentially John Scopes.
Right.
And so as a defense lawyer who used this defense of these folks before, like, Darwin made me do it kind of a thing, he's now defending the ability to teach Darwinism as it relates to human evolution in a trial, in the very next trial. And it's William Jennings Bryan who actually is the lawyer, the attorney the public attorney. He is for the state of Tennessee.
And he's actually playing a fairly small role by his standards. He is not the lead of the team. He is on the team. He doesn't even speak until day 5 of the trial.
Right.
So he's basically there for star power and to give the closing argument, which he, of course, never gets to give. We may get into that, but yeah. So as we approach the trial, do you want me to talk about the Butler Act?
I was gonna, before we get directly to that, I want to give people some more details, some of the background on to understand William Jennings Bryan, and so what his social causes before that. And then his concerns with what he's seeing with evolutionary theory, one of which in the trial you mentioned, Loeb and
Leopold and Loeb,
Leopold and Loeb, would have been one of the things that he's seeing something when he hears a term like evolution. There are other things in his mind than maybe people are as aware of today. Some eugenics type of things, some atrocities that had happened in the name of social Darwinism. So I was hoping we could maybe fill in a little bit of the person, the ethical act, the moral person that he was, and as far as he was trying to change the world for the better by standing up against union bosses and for workers and doing things like that. So filling that out and filling out a little bit of his views on what he's viewing, his views on evolution as he's seeing it play out in the world around him.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying the show. And before we go any further, I just want to say this. If you're watching this and enjoying the conversation, we'd love for you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so that you don't miss future episodes. Now, believe it or not, about 90% of the people who watch our videos aren't subscribed. And if just a fraction of you hit that button, it would make a huge impact for us. It's one simple, totally free way to support our ministry and help others discover thoughtful Christian content in a culture full of conflict, one that's searching for meaning. So go ahead, subscribe, like, and share. It really does help us out. And now, back to the content.
Well, that's a fascinating story. The causes that Bryan got involved with were almost always on behalf of the little guy, the common man. And so Bryan knew a lot of people. He owned a farm and was frequently in Lincoln, Nebraska when he would go home before he moved to Florida late in life for his wife's health, because Nebraska is really cold in the wintertime. I grew up there, so that's my interest in Bryan started with as just being in the state where he was from. But anyway, so he knew farmers. He would use anecdotes from people he knew personally about how a tax policy, for example, was affecting the farmer and so on. So he was always interested in how government policy could be used to improve the lives of common people. And because of his alignment with those kind of people, he was called the commoner, because he could relate to the common people. He would find himself in small towns, and he would walk through the town and go to the general store and understood the economics that the general store manager was facing, and how can government help that policy. And so he got involved in 4 constitutional amendments: women's right to vote, the income tax, direct election of senators, and prohibition. Of course, prohibition was later overturned, but he was also seeing the ways that railroad and big corporations were manipulating small farmers, and so he wanted to regulate the railroads. We wouldn't necessarily agree with his solution, but his alignment of what the problem was, we would certainly be sympathetic to. That's a whole story in itself on the railroad issue, how it is that he could go to the rights of the common man and end up trying to regulate railroads. So he always saw government as a way he could solve a problem. Again, we might not agree with that, but he was always doing it for the right reasons. So those are some of the causes that he was interested in.
And then as far as the evolutionary framework, there were certain things that he is, again, seeing in the world around him. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit to that too, as far as his view of evolution coming into it, because it's not
there's a number
of scientific theory.
No, you're right. He really changed his position from before World War I until the conduct of the war and afterwards. He's sometimes viewed as a pacifist. That's not accurate. He was actually a colonel in the militia and was activated and was willing to go to Cuba during the during that conflict earlier in the century. But he was not a pacifist, but he believed in proper application of force and didn't think that we had a role to play in World War I. So before World War I, think back to 1908, he runs his last campaign. By 1911, he's made this switch to largely religious evangelist, and he's interviewed in the New York Times. And at that point, he basically says, if you want to believe in evolution, I don't find fault with you, but you're going to have to find more convincing proof before you convince me that I have a relative who's swinging from the trees. Mm-hmm. And so he's basically letting bygones be bygones. But something happens in the late teens as the U.S. is getting closer to entry into the war. There's a man named Vernon Kellogg who wrote a book called Headquarters Nights, which he depicts the story of what's happening in Europe during World War I before the U.S. gets involved. And it turns out that people were disappearing. They were getting loaded into boxcars and being taken to slave labor camps. And this happened in World War I. We don't talk about that much, but that was the precursor. And so this book by Vernon Kellogg was probably influential on Bryan because they reviewed it in his newspaper, The Commoner. Mm-hmm. And the review of the book was pretty accurate as far as describing the book and the atrocities that were happening, and the fact that Vernon Kellogg was spending his evenings, because he was an aid humanitarian worker, again, an American in Belgium before World War I, dispensing aid, and he's spending his evenings with German officers in their headquarters. And so the book Headquarters Nights is about his conversations with the German officers. This book describes how they believed in Nietzschean and Darwinian theory, which many of the ideas in that book find their way into Bryan's lectures as he gets closer to and then beyond World War I. So fast forward after World War I, there's another New York Times editorial, and Bryan's attitude toward evolution is much more vociferous than it was before. It was much stronger. It was no longer live and let live. It was, this is dangerous, and the outcome of thinking about people evolving into higher advanced races is that then lower advanced races can be subjugated and can be enslaved and can be abused. And so he saw Darwinian theory and Nietzschean philosophy leading to human action, and that action was bad. It was allowing the race that was supposed to be superior to do whatever they wanted to other races. And so that is really the reason why he didn't want human evolution taught as fact in public schools. Now, he never objected to teaching of evolution in general, but the teaching of humans as evolving from lower races, and I've never seen a quote on this, but I'm guessing probably that the special creation of Adam would have been part of that, so that we had this divine image of God imprint on humanity, setting us apart from other animals, at least when Adam was created. So that's kind of does that answer your question on that?
Yeah, I just wanted, I thought it would be helpful to give some background, because it also makes sense then of why he decides to try and help with this trial. And it's not just I'm a creationist who just wants them to put the 10 Commandments, in the schoolroom, and I'm just against it because of that. But it's sort of the two prongs of his issues with teaching evolutionary theory because of what has happened in the world when people have taught it as sort of this principle sort of way of life, and then the idea of standing up for those who are being bullied by some sort of organization or bureaucracy or something, saying you must do this. He's always been on the side of the little guy, and in this case he viewed that as that. And so we can get into the Butler Act, but sort of this idea of they are being forced to teach something that parents and taxpayers didn't want to be taught anyway.
Well, and this is a short comment by me, but how interesting is this, that William Jennings Bryan gets involved in the Scopes trial because he thinks that Darwinism, specifically its social Darwinistic implications, with Nietzschean philosophy and these kind of things, can lead to bad actions. And Clarence Darrow just got done defending people who based their bad actions on the very philosophies he's about to come against and say, see, I told you, this stuff is bad. And by the way, Clarence Darrow agrees with me because he just offended two people saying that, they didn't get off. They just didn't get the death penalty. But it's my understanding. He didn't say they're not guilty. He just said they shouldn't die because these philosophies influence their actions. So what is really interesting is you have these two giants who are coming together to oppose each other at the trial. And again, with William Jennings Bryan being a little bit more of a backseat player until day 5. But the hype is about the two giants who are coming against each other. And essentially, in one aspect, they agree with each other, that the philosophy does matter. It leads to action. And in one sense, that action can be excused because the philosophy made me do it. In another, Bryan is saying, no, the philosophy will lead you to do it. And if we're starting excusing it, we're going to head into a social sort of chaos, as it were. Now, interesting aside, lawyers don't have to agree with their positions. They just have to, good faith, promote their positions. So whether or not Clarence Darrow actually believed that you should be able to not get the death penalty because your philosophy influenced you is one thing, but it was expedient for his clients is another. That's kind of how the law works, practice of law works. That's one interesting thing, is that they both kind of viewed ideas have consequences. And to quote John Stonestreet on this, ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims.
Yeah, victims, that's right.
Yeah, so they both agree with this. But the other part that's interesting is, in light of what you just said, Rick, we have to acknowledge something. William Jennings Bryan is a complex guy. So he did feel that there would be this social Darwinian, if you taught human evolution, you'd essentially scientifically justify one race dominating and subjugating another. But he had some complex views on race as well, as some that we would consider racial, at least racially problematic, if not outright racist as well.
Sure.
He had no problem with segregation and Jim Crow laws and these kind of things. So speak a little bit about that before we get into the Butler Act itself.
Yeah, again, another very complex issue that I don't have fully resolved, and historians, like lawyers, don't necessarily agree with their subjects, even if they find themselves liking them or endorsing some of their views. So yeah. I do find myself very much on Bryan's side in many of the cases that he fought, and yet this issue of the racial difference is a glaring log in his eye.
Yeah.
And it's a contradiction that never gets resolved. But if he truly believed that evolution of mankind did not happen, that it was by special creation, then there should have been no difference between races. What Bryan believed was that there was different capability between races. And again, in a New York Times interview, not too long before, just a couple of years before he passed, again, I think it was 1923 or 24, he's talking about whether blacks could ever be elected to high office, and he says he didn't think that they had the capability. Yeah. And this is in spite of some very, very prominent black politicians and lawyers, and you have I'm drawing a blank on the names of some of the guys I'm thinking of that he interacted with.
Yeah.
But he always treated people with great respect. It's interesting. I found an unpublished biography of his by a former pastor who had been a family pastor, who quoted a man who was Bryan's steward when he was the Secretary of State. He was a black, identified as a Negro in this 1920s era biography. But it said that this steward quoted people all around him as saying that Bryan treated everybody equally with great respect. This black steward felt incredibly well cared for and honored and loved by Bryan, even though Bryan at the same time didn't think that the blacks capable of high office. Yeah. So again, it's this incredible contradiction that can't be totally resolved. His personal interactions with people were incredibly respectful, but he did have kind of a blind spot there, and you can't get around it.
Yeah. 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 Okay. So set the tone. The Butler Act is a law around which this whole trial focuses.
Right. And so by 1923 and 24, Bryan is going around the country advocating that legislatures pass regulations limiting the teaching, again, of just human evolution. And he has a model act that he's encouraging people to use, that is from Florida, where he was living at the time. And it basically said you cannot teach the evolution of humans as fact, in the public schools.
Okay.
What the Butler Act did in Tennessee was tie that to teaching the evolution of humans, contradicting the divine story as taught in the Bible. And that was problematic because they encoded in law a particular religion. So that left the door open for a test case based on a religious establishment. Although the national government is restricted from establishing a religion, state governments are not. So there are many early, especially the early, the early states, the first 13 colonies. Many of those had an established religion in their constitution. So again, you can do that at the state level. So that's not necessarily a contradiction. But anyway, they did this, and it certainly left the door open for Darrow to make a case out of it.
Yeah.
But what Bryan was trying to do was say that the parents have rights, and the parents' rights to control the education of their children supersedes the right of a teacher to have free speech. A teacher has free speech anytime, except when he's being paid by people to teach curriculum. And then the people that pay him have the ability to control the content of that curriculum. That was the basic argument that was employed in the Scopes case by the prosecution.
So, because people typically characterize this thing as science versus religion, is that Darrow and Scopes and their supporters were the champions of science, and that William Jennings Bryan and the state of Tennessee and all this stuff was championing religion, and they saw this idea of Darwinian evolution as a threat to the truth or veracity of religion. And so this was the great legal version of the Enlightenment almost. You had the Enlightenment beforehand,
Yeah.
and the Enlightenment rationalists had won, so to speak, even though there were plenty of Christians who were involved in the Enlightenment. People don't know that either. But this is the prize fight version of that. But what you're saying is it's not really about that. It's really about, that might fuel it, and the way the Butler Act is worded certainly is problematic in terms of the Establishment Clause. And yeah, you mentioned the whole state thing and the federal thing, but really what it was about was something other than science versus religion. It was really a rights issue.
Correct. Yes, and so the issue is who controls educational content, and so both Darrow and Bryan had very strong positions on this teaching of Darwinian evolution, and they were on opposite sides, of course. But that's not what the trial was about. And so you've got the ACLU, which funded the initial, so let's go back for a second. The Butler Act is passed and signed into law in March of 25. The next month, the ACLU puts an ad in Tennessee newspapers saying, "We want to test this law. Who wants to be a guinea pig?" And the city of Dayton, Tennessee, decided we'd like to be on the map. We just had a major business go out of business, a major business entity fail, which was the local coal mine. We got to get something going here in Dayton. We got to call attention to ourselves. This could be our opportunity to get headlines and get some publicity. So they said, we'll do it and we'll find somebody. And so they found John Scopes, which is, again, part of this interesting story. But the issue was not about evolution versus creation, but Darrow really wanted it to be. And so the ACLU wanted it to be about academic freedom. Darrow wanted it to be about evolution. He wanted to bring in a bunch of experts on Darwinian evolution to prove that it was science. Bryan, although he understood that it was a rights issue and had been advised by many people to stick to the case, and he did for the most part, stick to the issue of parents' rights to control education, but he really wanted it also to be about evolution. So he had written to a lot of prominent theologians and scientists that he thought might help bolster the case for his side of the argument, where Darrow was also bringing professors on his side. So they both wanted it to be about evolution, even though it wasn't about evolution. So you have this tension between the prosecution team wanting to stick to just the facts of the law. The legislature passed a law. Scopes violated it. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. We're not sure he actually ever taught evolution, but that was the accusation. Let's stick to that. Darrow was willing to make that case, but he also wanted to make it a bigger case about evolution. And so you've got, I view these two big dogs being held back by leashes, but they're straining at the leash the whole time.
But yeah, ultimately, culturally, that is going to be kind of the ramification of the case, right? I mean,
that's going to be the story that's told in the press, even though it wasn't the central issue of the case.
Right.
Well, that's the brilliance. That's the thing that, when you look at some of the best lawyers, the best strategists, not even just lawyers, but strategists, whether it's military, whether it's legal, whether it's cultural formation things. And this is an important thing for us to remember, is that the how ideas are framed and how a question is framed and whether you stick to it is really important. I mean, as a trial lawyer, you're trained. You pick a theme for your case and you stick to the theme and the evidence that's around the theme. And so that the jury can understand this is what we're talking about, this, not side issues, this. Stay focused here. This is the issue. And when you do it well, both sides compete for what the issue is. The brilliance of Darrow, because no one is saying the man was not brilliant. He clearly was.
No.
The brilliance of Darrow was that I think he knew Bryan wanted to make it about evolution too, because he has serious problems with it. And Bryan took the bait. And so Darrow brings all these people on who are going to testify as to the scientific veracity or the sort of the substantiation of evolution, human evolution as scientific. And Bryan can't help himself. He's going to say nope, and he's going to bring a bunch of theologians in. And now it becomes, so now this is what this is about. It's not about whether the parents get to pick. It's really about whether or not you think the Bible is the Word of God and should be championed over and against science itself. And that's exactly how it gets framed. And then everything after that basically makes William Jennings Bryan into this anti-science sort of backwards bumpkin guy who is up with a degree.
Because the first 4 days of the trial are about jury selection, which takes a long time.
Yeah.
If you read the transcript, it goes on and on and on. And then a big argument about whether expert testimony would be allowed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why the jury is actually dismissed during much of the trial, because most of the trial is about these arguments between the lawyers about what's going to be allowed and who the jurors are and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So the jury was hoping for a front row seat. They got almost no seat at all.
Mm-hmm.
They missed the Bryan Darrow cross-examination, et cetera.
Right.
So you're right. To be fair, though, Darrow tried to bring in a lot of expert witnesses. Mm-hmm. Bryan's expert witnesses mostly said, "We don't think this is a good idea. We're not available." So George McCready Price was one of the most prominent, not a trained scientist, but one who was pretty well educated in geology and had made the case against evolution scientifically. But all these guys that Bryan wanted to come and testify weren't available, so they didn't really have any expert witnesses on the Bryan side. So Bryan did stick to the rights issue, and his plan was to make this grandiose closing argument, which was going to be like a big oratory event, which eventually he is not able to make, because on the last day of the trial, before the closing arguments, Darrow pulls a fast one and says, we're going to request that the judge direct the jury to a guilty verdict, because obviously my client is guilty. And the reason he did that is because the only thing he cared about was taking the case to an appeals court to try and get the Butler Act declared unconstitutional. They couldn't do that at the county court level.
Right.
But if they went on appeal, they could attack the law directly. And so the whole thing for Darrow was getting the case a conviction for Scopes, so that they could appeal it to a level where they could do what he really wanted to do, which was then really get into the evolution issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, that's part of the whole chess match, part of this whole thing. So
absolutely,
just so everybody totally gets the picture here, is that it's typically considered an ethics violation to coerce your client to plead a certain kind of a way if you think he's not actually guilty of something. But clearly, the Butler Act was the Butler Act. And the question now, you alluded to it, did John Scopes actually ever teach evolution? So the question then becomes, whether he was guilty or not is a bit of an issue.
Yes.
Yet Darrow kind of gets him to admit that he was in fact guilty of it, so that Bryan wouldn't be able to give his closing argument, and then it can go to the appeals issue. So 2 questions. One, when you say it wasn't clear whether Scopes actually taught evolution, what do you mean? And then 2, did he get him to plead guilty so that Bryan wouldn't give his closing argument, or was it more of a chess move about the appeals issue?
I think it was both on the last part of the question. I think it was both to prevent Bryan from having his moment to possibly sway the jury, and also to set the stage for an appeal. But as far as Scopes teaching evolution, he was a math teacher, not a biology teacher, and he was the football coach. And he was a young guy. He was probably 24 years old at this point. And he, during the last week of school, he had been a substitute teacher because the biology teacher was out, and so they were reviewing for their final exams. And so basically, I envisioned Scopes in a room with a bunch of students who are reviewing. They're looking at their books. He's not really teaching directly. He's just kind of supervising the classroom while they're studying for their exams. The book that they were teaching from was an atrocious book called Hunter's Civic Biology. It had very little to do with biology and very much to do with public policy. And it advocated Darwinian conclusions in terms of eugenics, so weeding out those who are not fit for life. So it was an advocate of strongly advocating abortion, eugenics, all of those things that are associated with the worst possible excesses of Darwinism as public policy. So that's the book they were studying. When the town leaders said, we're going to take the ACLU up on this challenge, we got to find somebody to challenge the law. The biology teacher was an older guy with a family. He didn't want to put his reputation and his job at risk. So he said, nah, I'd rather not do that. But hey, this young guy who's probably not going to be around that long, he's just here to get some experience and go on to get a graduate degree. How about John Scopes? He taught during the week that we were reviewing for final exams. So they called Scopes in. He was playing tennis someplace, and he shows up sweaty with his tennis racket, and they sit him down and said, hey, you want to be a guinea pig? And they kind of explained it to him, and he was kind of a free speech advocate, and his father was a free thinker and an atheist, outspoken. That's a whole different part of the story, but Scopes says, yeah, I'll do that. He's kind of you don't get the impression that he's really all that much interested other than helping the town. He kind of likes people. He's popular as a young guy. And he says, I'm not sure I actually ever taught it, but he pulls a book off the shelf because the drugstore where they were meeting in was also the place that sold the textbooks to the school district. There's an interesting collusion there. but he pulls the book off the shelf because it happened to be there. And he says, well, it's in the book, so you must be able to say that I covered it. So he never taught it directly, most likely, and there's question about that for the rest of his life, but it's not a big issue. He's willing to plead guilty, or he's willing to be indicted, and then eventually to plead guilty.
Wow, because and just the ethics stuff comes flooding back from law school and legal practice about whether or not it was a good idea for, or even if it was even a violation of the ethics, about whether or not is there any clear evidence that Scopes was okay with a guilty plea, and to be convicted of a crime later to have his day in court, as it were, in the appeals. But do we have any indication? This is a point of curiosity. It's a quick question.
Sure.
Do we have any indication whether Scopes was like, I'm on board, cool, good idea, let's do it?
Yeah, I think he was.
Okay.
He has an autobiography later that's written called Center of the Storm. He writes much later.
Yeah.
Where he tries to portray himself as a free speech advocate and fully on board. It was a misdemeanor offense. The worst, the penalty was $100 to $500. Bryan suggested that they should write the law without any penalty at all, following the Florida example, but they did put a small penalty involved. In fact, that's where I don't know if you want to go to this or not, but that's how the whole thing gets dismissed at a higher level, is because the judge imposes a fine. The jury was supposed to impose the fine. So when Darrow does appeal the case, it goes to the Tennessee Supreme Court, and the Tennessee Supreme Court doesn't want to touch this issue with a hot potato with a long stick.
Yeah.
And so they basically say, oh, well, we're going to set the verdict aside because the wrong person imposed the fine.
Yeah.
Now, the fine was paid by the Baltimore Sun. Scopes wasn't going to have to pay it anyway. Bryan offered to pay any fine because he didn't want it to be about the money and about the penalty. So he said, if there's a fine imposed, I'll pay it. He didn't end up paying it. The Baltimore Sun did. That's H.L. Mencken's paper. Anyways, but to answer your question, Scopes does seem to be kind of an idealistic free thinker who wants to make this about freedom of speech and academic freedom. And so the competing rights are freedom of speech. Do you have freedom of speech when you're employed to teach a specific curriculum, or do the parents who control the curriculum and the purse strings through their elected legislatures have the right to control that curriculum? And that's where we get into the direct link to Mahmoud, which is who controls education? Is it the parents? Is it the taxpayers? Or is it the government and academic freedom? So 100 years later, we're still arguing about that.
So before you get into any questions,
well, no, let's jump into that. Yeah,
I do want to talk about that for sure. But let's want to point out something interesting you said, and is that there is this fine imposed as a result of the violation of the Butler Act that Bryan himself wasn't a fan of including in the act. And then when it was there, the guy who was part of the prosecution team said, "I'll be happy to pay the fine." Right. That's just, it sort of goes back to this whole idea of the myth making of this thing. It's kind of like, Derek did an article on Copernicus and Galileo and this whole thing about how, there is this prevailing myth that the church was against science. And so here comes Copernicus and Galileo, these upstarts who are going to tell us that the sun is the center of the solar system and that the church doesn't like it. And so we're going to imprison them and excommunicate them, or at least not Copernicus, but Galileo, and do all this stuff. And that's not really how it went. It was far more complex than that. And so the facts you're telling us make the whole situation with this case far more complex, actually, than this simple idea of Bryan was this guy who just doesn't like science and doesn't want them with their fancy book learning coming into this town and telling us what to teach. Kind of, it's a lot more complex than that. It's
like the first thing that a culture war kills is nuance.
Yeah,
and that's exactly what it seems like they're trying to do. And of course, having the ACLU behind it, but the idea is we already know what we want to do with this case, and we know sort of the story we want to tell with it.
Yeah.
And the battle that's actually going on here seems like something, it is this cultural phenomenon that, again, a lot of those stories about like Copernicus and Galileo have already been told in that way. Mm-hmm. So there's already the tradition by the time this is happening of sort of revisioning the past as this battle, this ancient battle between faith and rational thinking and scientific progress. And you've got the Dark Ages and all this, all of these theories are being tossed around that we know now aren't really real, but it's hard to convince people of that,
especially then and there.
Yeah.
So let's get into the Mahmoud thing, because I do want to, in the time we have remaining, we don't have a ton, but the time we have remaining, I want to talk about the way in which this whole thing has its relevance now. We're talking about this one to commemorate the fact that it's 100 years ago, and some people are championing it as the day that Darwin won. Finally, kind of a thing in American jurisprudence. Others are like yourself are saying, hey, there's a way more to it than this. And this is a great occasion to get into the way more to it than this. And we're going to include, by the way, a link to your dissertation on this in the show notes, and in the description of the YouTube, as well. So people can get into detail, and there's way more detail, but in the time remaining, what I wanted to talk about was its application, because one of the reasons to talk about it is, why is it important for us to talk about it now other than historical curiosity? Why does it have implications now? Because we're actually dealing with these issues right now. So the Mahmoud versus Taylor example is a case is one example of it. We're talking about rights and these kind of things. So speak to us about that. I have a comment. I talked to you before the show started, a little bit about a comment about a possible distinction between these two things, but and get your reaction to that. So go ahead and talk to us about what's going on in Mahmoud versus Taylor, and how the Scopes trial sort of informs us about that.
Yeah. So again, I would defer to your expertise on Mahmoud, except for the overview, which I can get the overview out of the brief skimming of the Supreme Court case that I did read. So it's a coalition of parents in Mahmoud that are objecting to the teaching of the transgender issue, as I believe is the specific issue that they were concerned about. And it was a coalition of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish parents. So it's not a religious, and probably some atheists as well, but that were opposed to the teaching of transgender ideology. The whole, what is a woman? Can we change sexes kind of an issue. and they objected to that being taught to their very young children. That case went eventually to the Supreme Court to say that parents have the right to control the content of that portion of the curriculum, and that educators cannot force that ideology, which is what it's become, onto their children. My concern with the outcome is that it's a preliminary injunction and that it was remanded for retrial. So talking to a lawyer friend yesterday, and you, again, would be a better expert on this, the Supreme Court decision will weigh very heavily on that retrial and may control the outcome, but it's still something that's left to the lower courts to make a determination. It may come back again. So that's kind of my overview of that case.
Yeah.
But it's about parents' rights to control curriculum.
Yeah, and it's made headlines because of the injunction, so it can go back to court because it's going to be something we're going to be wrestling with for quite some time now, and the determinations will be made. So how does it relate to the Bryant case? Because the Scopes case, because as we've been talking about, it was more of a rights issue than it was a science versus religion issue. But one could argue that it was the right to teach science as a public educator versus the right of parents to say, or even the legislature to say, not in my school.
Right. So the legislature is acting on the bequest of those who elected them, ostensibly. So my thinking on this is that if the Tennessee legislature at that time sensed the desire of the parents to restrict teaching of human evolution, they, as a legislature, can take action on behalf of the parents to put their right to control education content into a law. Now, if the mood of the public is changed through persuasive argument, through a long process of discourse, at some point the public might in fact elect legislators who would reverse that law. That's the way the process is designed to work. A legislative action can be redone by election that puts people in that are sympathetic to the position you hold. And if that becomes the majority position, those legislators would then change the law. That's not what happened. Instead, they went to the courts. Darrow, specifically in the ACLU, wanted to go to the courts to override the law and override the will of the public. Whether the Butler Act was a perfect delineation of what the public felt, is debatable. But if there was a public outcry, they could elect people that would reverse the law. Instead, they wanted to short circuit it, as we often see, too often, in my view, see the people going to the courts to override publicly elected legislators' actions.
Yeah, and that's sort of the issue of the day. And without going too far afield to making this a legal conversation as opposed to sort of a faith-based conversation from a Christian perspective, what you have is a system of checks and balances where the courts, the Supreme Court specifically, but the lower courts under its jurisdiction or under its ambit within the federal system can determine whether a law is unconstitutional. That's not actually what happened in the original trial. It was whether he was guilty of violating this act. The constitutionality of it was never actually at issue. You could have
That's correct.
You could have gone to the federal courts immediately. Scopes could have been the lead plaintiff in a case that goes right to the federal courts and says this law, as applied, either de facto or de jure, to John Scopes and all teachers and all school systems within Tennessee is in fact unconstitutional. Whether the Supreme Court of Tennessee or you have to do it in the lower courts to do it, but you could have gone the constitutional route, but instead it went the criminal route, which is just interesting all by itself. But Mahmoud versus Taylor.
Well, you should have been advising the ACLU at the time that they might have gone that route.
Well, that's what they do now. That's how they do it now. But interestingly, in Mahmoud versus Taylor, here's why someone who even agrees with the parents, for example, might say, but the Scopes trial is different because let's say some teacher is teaching, the standard model of cosmology. He's a physics teacher, and he's going to teach that the universe began from a point of density at some finite point in the past, perhaps billions of years ago, and that the majority of scientists actually agree that the universe began, 15 billion years ago. And from this point, and it's a big standard Big Bang cosmology. And a bunch of parents are like, whoa, you're not teaching that to my kid. That goes against the Bible. I actually don't think it does, but let's say someone says that, and The issue would be, are you really going to say that just because a bunch of parents in a certain school district don't want their kids learning what has become standard science, that you're going to let the parents run over the science, and to the detriment, just because the parents want it doesn't mean it's a good thing. It can be bad for the kids, kind of a thing. Mahmoud versus Taylor is not about that. It's really about an ideology, a cultural ideology. Science has got zero to do with it. So science is like this, no scientist would say that everything we believe is objective fact, and they hold it provisionally, but it's a method by which you test how the observable world works. And they'd say Mahmoud versus Taylor is a cultural issue. So yes, you're teaching kids cultural things that may or may not be good for the good, and so parents should be able to opt out. Bryan, the Scopes trial is different. You're saying this should be illegal to even teach this science. And so that's why they might say that's a difference between these two things. So speak to that. Was Bryan were they speaking to the science issue? We already kind of talked about it, but it was more of a rights issue. So should the parents be able to say, you can't teach my kids stuff that's actually scientifically, or at least a perspective of a scientifically based or a scientific sort of quote unquote establishment view on things like the Big Bang or evolution?
Well, I love Derek's comment earlier that culture wars eliminate nuance. I may have to use that at some point.
Yeah.
Because I think that's part of the answer, is that people today think, the way I describe it, people think meme deep.
Yeah.
If you can't reduce it to a soundbite, they don't understand it. They don't really care enough to try. Mm-hmm. And so these are complex issues. And what we see more and more, especially with today's rhetoric, if you will, is we'll see this term settled science, mm-hmm. where there's usually not sufficient evidence to justify a conclusion. They'll say, well, it's settled science, you can't argue with it. And there was a very brief period in this transsexual agenda within the last couple of years where people were trying to start saying settled science when it was totally not settled science. Yeah. And so part of the answer to your question, I think, is how much evidence is there to validate the thing you're trying to teach. And that also was not, that again is what Bryan wanted to go to, because he made some interesting scientific arguments, which I make the case in a recent article that his scientific points have never been refuted. Mm-hmm. Things like origin of life, we don't have a clue on origin of life, but some people think that we do. And so the question is, are we teaching something that is indeed settled science, or is the jury still out on some of this stuff? And should we instead be teaching what the strengths and weaknesses are of a given idea, whether it's the nebular hypothesis with cosmology or evolution with regard to the origin of species? Shouldn't we be teaching what the strengths and the weaknesses are of those things, so that the kids have an opportunity to know, well, there are some questions about this, and it's not settled. So I think Christians in general do a better job of teaching Darwinian evolution than the public schools do, because they teach a balanced view. So we were homeschooled for parents for a while, and we taught about evolution. I think our kids have a better balanced perspective on it than most public school kids do, because they only hear one side of the story.
Yeah, right. Well, one of the things as we wrap up, because time does run short and we do have the heart out, that first of all, Rick, I want to thank you for being on the show. Yeah.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, and for shedding some light on an unnuanced chapter of American history that requires some nuance. But I'll tell you that, to me, one of the biggest nuances here is that, one, public figures can be very complex people, whether it's Darrow or it's Bryan. Mm-hmm. And Bryan has some things in his past and his political philosophy that I thought were, that we would consider abhorrent today. He opposed the scientific or so-called scientific racism of evolution, but didn't oppose the structural racism of his day. So people are complex. But in the same sense, though, what we just talked about is really the conclusion here is that when we have a dogmatism about, in the public system, where we have a dogmatism about secularism or religion for that matter, if we want to teach something to give a well-orbed view to our kids and to ourselves, we're a big advocate for critical thinking here on All Rise. What you want to do is give the best possible version of an argument and then show its flaws so that you can actually make an assessment for yourself. I think of the intelligent design movement now trying to say, look, we're not asking you to teach as true or as fact that there was an intelligent designer to everything. All we're asking you to do is to teach it side by side, alongside, give the best argument you can for naturalistic evolution and give the best argument you can for intelligent design and say these are at least two of the competing theories for how we got here. And then make a determination yourself. Give a fully orbed view. And I think that from a Christian perspective, what you want is, you don't want uninformed minds. You want as informed a mind as you can possibly have. That is what the Christian mandate is that you have nothing to fear from truth. Truth, though uncomfortable, ultimately liberates. And I think that's exactly what we need to see, and not have caricatures of history, whether it's the Scopes trial or anything else for that matter, that caricaturizes the search for truth and critical thinking. So those are kind of my closing thoughts on this whole thing.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add some context to this. As we've kind of looked at William Jennings Bryan and gotten some of his motivations, I did just want to read a longer quote that I think is important. I know the heart out is my heart out, so I'm allowed to break it.
Okay, good.
But I thought it was important because, again, to try and understand the heart behind some of what's going on, and I think we've gotten a glimpse of the heart of Bryan. But one of the popularizers of this myth was a journalist for the Baltimore Evening Sun named H.L. Mencken. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to quote him because, one of the tragedies of this is, and some people say, William Jennings Bryan died of something like a broken heart. He was a broken man after what he had been dragged. So he'd been kind of dragged through the mud in the press. 5 days after the case has ended, he dies, I believe, of a heart attack.
The official cause of death is apoplexy, which means we don't know what caused him. He died in his sleep.
Okay. And so, but I wanted to quote here, this is, Mencken wrote this one day after Bryan died. And this is sort of his farewell to William Jennings Bryan by this journalist. Mm-hmm. And I just found this fascinating. And he writes about Bryan: he came into life a hero, a Galahad, in bright and shining armor. Now he was passing out a pathetic fool. It is the national custom to sentimentalize the dead, as it is to sentimentalize men about to be hanged. Perhaps I fall into that weakness here. The Bryan I shall remember is the Bryan of his last weeks on earth, broken, furious, and infinitely pathetic. Bryan was a vulgar and common man, a cad undiluted. He was ignorant, bigoted, self-seeking, blatant, and dishonest. His career brought him into contact with the first men of his time. He preferred the company of rustic ignoramuses. It was hard to believe, watching him at Dayton, that he had traveled, that he had been received in civilized societies, that he had been a high officer of state. He seemed only a poor clod like those around him, deluded by a childish theology, full of an almost pathological hatred of all learning, all human dignity, all beauty, all fine and noble things. He was a peasant come home to the dung pile. Imagine a gentleman, and you have imagined everything he was not. The job before democracy is to get rid of such canaille.
Wow.
So this is the guy who set the stage for now what we think about this trial. So again, part of one of the things that I wanted to bring out in talking about this too, and that Dr. Townsend has done so well, is just the way that, when you get a story like this, it is important to look at who's writing it and why they're writing it. Because that's the guy who tells us everything the world thinks they know about Bryan. And as we've just learned, Bryan was complicated, yes, but on the majority of what he did in his life was standing up for a lot of things that people left and right think we should be standing up for. And he was a wise man in many ways too. So it's just important, I think, to understand where this story came from.
And I want to reserve my right to amend my closing argument now and take back a minute or two. That's really something, because what that calls to mind, that quote by Mencken, calls to me a caution to Christians, and everyone in general, but Christians especially, because you claim to be, if you're a Christian, you claim to follow the one who is the way, the truth, and the life, which means that your way must be truthful and life-giving. And that kind of quote is anything but that.
Yeah.
It's to even start it off by saying that I have a sentimentality about the dead and perhaps I'm falling victim to it, and then I'm going to lay waste to this man's character, is word peddling at best. And it's very tough to hear that and not think of another quote, perhaps a better quote, from C.S. Lewis. And this is what he says: suppose one reads a story of filthy atrocities in the paper. Then suppose that something turns up suggesting that the first story might not be quite true, or not quite so bad as it was made out originally. Is one's first feeling, thank God, even those people we hate so much, aren't quite so bad as that? Or is it a feeling of disappointment and even a determination to cling to the first story for the sheer pleasure of thinking your enemies are as bad as possible? If it is the second, then it is, I am afraid, the first step in a process which, if followed to the end, will make us into devils. You see, one is beginning to wish that black was a little blacker. If we give that wish its head, later on we shall wish to see gray as black, and even to see white itself as black. Finally, we shall insist on seeing everything, God and our friends and ourselves included, as bad, and not be able to stop doing it. We shall be fixed forever in a universe of pure hatred. So you take a look at that, and you hear him say this, and he has couched this man in these terms. As complex and as flawed as the man was, zero nuance is given. That is the most unnuanced quote I think I've heard in a long time from Mencken. And then you look and you say to us as Christians, what should we take from this? And the answer is this: that those who might oppose your worldview, those who might oppose your ideologies, those who might say, hey, you know what? I don't agree with the way you think of human flourishing or the best for the world. You look at them and you can divorce the value of their ideas from their value as human beings, so they have an ontological beauty which is based in God's image, and you won't write things like we just heard from H.L. Mencken that characterizes somebody in such a character assassination kind of a way. Rather, we'll do what Lewis suggests, is that, thank God, maybe not even they are as awful or as bad or wayward as that. And then maybe think of yourself too. And in what ways have I been uncharitable, unkind, and just blind in some ways? We ought to engage with ideas, and not every idea deserves respect. But the people who hold those ideas have an inherent dignity, no matter how much you might not like their ideas, because they're made in God's image. So I'd say that is my actual closing statement.
Well, and let's do something a little differently this week, too. Let's let our guest have
the last word.
The last word. And also, I want you to share a little bit about, you said you have a book-length project that you're working on that's going to tie into some of the stuff you've done with the monkey trial. So I'll have to hear about that.
Well, thank you for that. I'm working on a book-length project which will outline the history of Darrow and Scopes leading up to this point. They had a long history beginning in at least 1896 when Bryan ran for president the first time. Darrow supported him. He supported him in his second run in 1900, but by 1908 he had become disillusioned with Bryan's increasing religiosity and conservatism. And so they had this sense of animosity, and so it kind of outlines the story of their relationship over a 30-year period. So that I'm working on that, and other than that, the dissertation, I hope people may find portions of it interesting. That chapter 6 is what deals with the Scopes trial. Chapter 7, I believe, is the chapter on his racist tendencies. So I outline those things. It's a bit of an academic work, and so it may be a slog for some folks for a lot of detail, but hopefully it's written in a way that will be helpful as well.
Yeah.
And then also I would like to point out, Salvo magazine did a summer edition this year, which is commemorating mostly on the Scopes trial. There's some other things in there as well, but most of the articles have to do with the 100th anniversary. And I have an article in there that outlines the four four of the scientific claims Bryan made. There were actually some others, but I focused on four things like origin of life and the ability of one species to change into another, and the fact that scientific research still has not refuted any of the claims that Bryan made 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So it turns out he was not as wrong as they claimed.
Yeah.
And so Salvo magazine is a really cool Christian perspective magazine. And so it has some articles by Nancy Pearcey, Hugh Ross, a lot of really good thinkers, Jonathan Witt. So,
Awesome.
and Casey Luskin is in there with a couple of contributions with Bryan Miller.
Great.
Well, we'll make sure to link your article there.
Yeah,
too.
absolutely.
So
absolutely.
Great.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
This was awesome.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Yeah, enjoyed meeting you earlier when we had a phone conversation a while back, and this has been really a lot of fun for me to talk about something. Obviously, I've had a little bit of time to think through.
Yeah.
And your perspectives have been helpful, so I appreciate your legal perspectives on it.
Great. My pleasure, and thanks again for being on the show, Rick. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, the defense rests.